you're probably thinking about research. And so obviously the PhD programs are going to encourage you to focus on your research for your training and then afterwards too. Okay? But then there's also the MD route where you're focusing on clinical medicine, right? You're seeing patients, you're focusing on the clinical aspects of biomedical issues and topics. Okay? And then there's the other opportunity, the MD/PhD. And so this is for people who are truly confused and they can't really decide between the two options. And so there's a lot of overlap. And so they really want to focus on both. Okay, so they MD/PhD. Sometimes they're also referred to as MSTP programs, so medical science training programs. And so you're probably familiar with that acronym too. Okay, so as you think about for the MD/PhD route, be wary of that. So I talk with lots of students as they're thinking about that, but it's kind of interesting. So I talk with a lot of undergrad students, but I occasionally encounter some students who are like freshmen and trying to think about that route, and I sort of wonder, why are you thinking about the MD/PhD that early as an undergrad? So you want to make sure that you actually want to focus on the MD and the PhD, okay? So, but the MD/PhD can be a wonderful opportunity. When I was in grad school, I had these friends. They were incredibly sharp couple. So both the husband and wife were in MSTP programs. So the husband was getting his PhD in physics and also in medical school, and the wife was in medical school, but also getting her PhD in English literature. And so you sort of wonder, what, English literature and MD, what's going on there? But it was really interesting overlap. What she was studying was old pieces of English literature and the references to medicine and technology and science. And she was also using her MD to understand the medical aspects too. So it's a really wonderful overlap of English literature and medical sciences. So that's a wonderful opportunity. And so how else can you do that besides getting an MD/PhD? So that's a wonderful opportunity, but make sure that you want that opportunity because obviously there's the training for that involves much more time and energy and so forth. Okay? But so as you think about these different opportunities, I do sort of wonder, does it sort of feel like a game show and there's a tacky host and hostesses and so forth, and you're trying to choose between the 3 different doors, right? And so you're trying to figure out, okay, which door do I select? Okay? And so you might have voices, like in a game show, where people are yelling, choose door number 1, choose door number 2, or whatever. But in reality, you would probably have close friends, your parents, and so forth, clamoring for your attention, trying to give you advice and so forth. And sometimes that advice might be helpful, and sometimes it may not. But I do talk with quite a few students who say that, in terms of my interest and my skills and so forth, I really want to do this, but my parents really want me to do this. Okay, so that can provide a lot of anxiety and fears and problems as you're trying to make that decision. So it can be incredibly difficult. Okay, so as you think about this, as you think about game shows, you want to try to avoid this sound, where you end up sort of the dud and you sort of get the thing that you don't really want. So I do occasionally work with students. There was this one exceptional case where there was this student who started an MD program. After a couple of years, decided that wasn't for her. She went on to a PhD program, and then after a couple of years, decided that wasn't for her. And even though she had an opportunity to finish with her master's degree, she decided to leave. She was also in the process of getting married and having a child. And then after a couple of years, she decided to go into another PhD program, but they didn't admit her. And so I think that can be the downfall. If you start bouncing around or waffling too much, that can be to your detriment. There is some flexibility. You can switch from one to the other, but you want to be careful you're not bouncing around too much, obviously. Okay? But let's continue thinking about this and think about how are you going to make that decision? What's your decision-making process for this? Okay? So one easy thing to do, and all of you are doing this, is obviously looking online and attending conferences like this as you're trying to make decisions, right? You're gathering information about different training programs, different career opportunities. You're attending conferences, seminars, and so forth. That's really important. So that's wonderful. You're doing step number 1. Okay? But there's plenty of other things that you can continue doing. You can also conduct what's referred to as informational interviews. Okay? So I'm not sure if people are familiar with that term, informational interviews, but this is something that you can do to actually interview. So you're actually interviewing someone else that is doing something that you think that you might be interested in. So as you think about this, I do really encourage you to do informational interviews with people at multiple stages. So you're basically interviewing them so at the early stage where they're still in their training, at the early stages of their career, in the mid stage, and at later stages of their career. Okay? So don't simply talk with other students that are at the early stages. Talk with people in the full breadth of their careers. So you can see how people bounce around, how they move, in terms of their flexibility and so forth. Okay, so but really do informational interviews. I highly encourage you to do that. If you're not familiar with that term, just do a Google search on informational interviews. There's lots of advice about how to conduct one, but it's basically just talking with someone who's doing something that you might be interested in and gathering information for yourself and building your network. Okay. Something else that you would possibly do is also just try temporary experiences. So do internships, summer programs, and so forth, visits, and try to volunteer in lots of different opportunities. So try these temporary experiences. And these temporary experiences are also really valuable because they're simply temporary. So that if someone asks you later on, why did you stop doing that? You can simply say, it was just meant to be only for the summer or just for a semester or a quarter or something like that. So those temporary experiences really help you to test out, if you're really going to really settle into that type of role, or if you really find that you don't really want to do that. Okay. But there's also the fourth thing that I'm going to encourage you to think about, and so this is for the largest chunk for the next few minutes that we're going to talk about this, is actually consult a research study that actually followed students along as an undergrad student and interviewed them along as they chose career opportunities for themselves. And so this is really fascinating because for this particular study, they followed students and actually noticed that students had certain patterns in terms of how they thought about their careers, how they thought about their interactions with other people, how they made decisions, and so forth. So this is really fascinating, and so this is what I'm really going to focus on for a large chunk for this session. Okay. So let's consult this research study, and here's some basic information. This study was conducted by Rick McGee and Joe Keller at the Mayo Clinic, which is in Minnesota. As you may know, the Mayo Clinic, it's a world-class medical school center. So Rick McGee moved on to Northwestern University, and so Rick was actually my old boss. I just came from Northwestern, and so Rick's a great guy. He's a really interesting character, too. Rick did his PhD and postdoc in biochemistry and neuroscience. So he was in the hardcore sciences. He moved on to faculty positions, got tenure, and so forth. But after a while, he started to shift directions and actually started working with students in professional development. So now he's got several R01 grants where he actually studies students. So you, all of you in the audience, you're guinea pigs for his studies. He actually follows students along, trying to understand how they make decisions, sometimes how they choose non-traditional paths, and distinctions between men and women, for minorities and non-minorities and so forth. So it's really fascinating. So he actually works, he's got a group of about a dozen sociologists that he works with. So he's shifted from the hard sciences into the social sciences. So Rick's a great guy. He's at Northwestern. Some of you might connect with him at conferences like ABRCAMS or SACNAS and so forth. And so he's a great guy. So you can look at his research studies and so forth and other papers too. Okay. And Joe Keller worked with him in a couple of projects and so continues to work with him too. Okay. So as I mentioned, so in terms of their study, they actually noticed the significant differences between those students who followed PhD career paths versus MD paths. And I'm going to unpackage that much more, obviously. But that's the main punchline, is that there were some significant differences in how these students chose their paths and what they preferred to do in terms of their work. Okay. In case you want to take a look at the actual paper, this is also in the handout, but this is a paper that came out in 2007 by Rick McGee and Joe Keller. Okay, so for the research study, I need to give some background information to explain a little bit more about this. So the study participants, there were 26 students. So these were students who were in an undergrad summer research program at the Mayo Clinic. These were rising juniors and seniors. So basically this means that after the end of the summer, they were going into their junior or their senior years as an undergrad. Okay? The average GPA was around 3.7, so this is a pretty strong, academically strong set of students that they were looking at. For the Mayo summer program, it's pretty competitive, and so they're able to attract those type of students. Okay. Further, in terms of the study design, what they did is that they interviewed students, and these were open-ended questions. It wasn't like a multiple-choice online survey. So they actually met with the actual student participants, and these were open-ended questions. And so that's pretty important here. So that the idea was that as they were interviewing students, the hypothesis was just basically allowing the students to say basically whatever they wanted to, and so that this didn't really restrict the students' responses to particular answers or set choices. Okay? So in terms of the interviews, they were conducted at the start and at the end of the summer program and about a year afterwards. But they also continue to follow the students into their training, into the graduate programs that they moved on to. Okay? So this was the study design and the student participants. Okay? So moving on to themes that did not differentiate. So I want to start off at the very beginning with those themes that they noted for those students who chose MD and PhD routes. Okay? So both PhD and MD students expressed these strong themes during their open-ended questions during these interviews. Okay? So one theme was that all of these students were pretty self-confident. So they took intellectual risks. They took leadership roles when there was a need for an organization or something like that. They stepped into those roles. And they also were really proactive about asking questions. Okay? So they were pretty self-confident. They're also very action-oriented, so that if there were problems, if problems or obstacles arose, they took action. Okay? They didn't simply complain and whine about it. They took action to try to resolve problems and help other people too. Okay? So the two themes for the MD and the PhD students were that they were very self-confident and also action-oriented. Okay? And then now, moving on to the themes that did differentiate, and there were 5 themes, and there were very strong themes. So in other words, for those students who chose research training in PhD programs, they noted that those students who went to PhD programs, they noted that they expressed these themes very strongly during their interviews. Okay? But I should also point out that this also included those students, those few students who went into MD programs but chose to focus on research. Okay? So I'm guessing most of you are aware that even though if you go into MD training, that you can also emphasize your research component of that too. Okay? So those students who chose basically research training as their main focus, they expressed these 5 themes very strongly. Okay? And this is in contrast to those students who chose MD programs and focused on clinical medicine, wanted to work closely with patients and so forth. Okay? So there's a strong distinction in the themes. Okay? And you're all probably wondering, what are those 5 themes? Okay? I'm going to hold you in suspense a little bit longer and ask you to do a little self-reflection. Okay? Before we notice the 5 distinct themes, I would encourage you to do some self-reflection and help you decide. Okay? So these are some questions that's also on your handout. But, so you don't have to answer them now. You can just quietly do some self-reflection. You can take some notes about these questions. And I'm going to show them on the slides also here and elaborate them a little bit further too. But I need to point out a few things before we jump to these questions. I will note that we did actually use these questions. So Rick and I actually used these questions as we interviewed students at Northwestern. And this really helped us to get a sense of, are they really suited for a PhD program versus an MD program? Okay. I will also encourage you to don't force your answers. Don't think, okay, the interviewer wants to hear this, so I'm going to say that just for the sake of that. Okay? Just do some quiet self-reflection, and you can sort of answer that on your own. So you don't have to turn in these sheets or anything like that in the end. You're not getting graded here. Okay? I also want to point out that these questions only relate for those students who've had some research experience. Okay? So maybe you're a freshman or sophomore, you're still trying to figure things out, and that's perfectly fine. But these questions are going to relate for those students who've had some sort of research experience, like a summer research program, or been working with a lab for a year or so, something like that. Okay? So, but you can still think about these questions for yourself. You might help you sort of do some self-reflection too. Okay? So let's move on to question number 1. Okay? So this is also in the handout, but I'll elaborate here a little bit. Okay? So what do you enjoy about research, and what aspects of research interest and excite you? Okay? So for those of you who've had some research experience, you might sort of do some quiet self-reflection about that. So in other words, what's your motivation for doing research? Okay? So if you're trying to struggle between the research PhD route versus the MD clinical medicine route, hopefully you've thought about doing some research or you've done some research, but what really excites you or motivates you? Okay? Question number 2. When you encounter tough problems in research, how do you respond? What do you do? Basically, and also, how do you respond to obstacles, limitations, and to failures? Okay? So there's a full range. You might respond by crying or just shutting down, and I've done plenty of that myself. You might respond by asking for help, going to your close friend. You might respond by going to your mentor or a professor. You might respond by just trying harder, or you might think about looking for something else, look for other ways or other problems to solve. If that problem's really tough, maybe just look for other problems or challenges. So there's a full range of basically how do you respond to problems that you might encounter in research. Okay. Question number 3, in your work, how would you describe relationships with your mentors and supervisors? Is that relationship pretty close? Do you interact with your mentor pretty daily? Or is it pretty rare? Is it like once a week or once a month? Is it just by email? Do you seek for guidance pretty regularly? Or do you prefer to try to struggle through problems yourself and figure things out independently? And you'd rather to do that? What's your interaction like with your research mentor or supervisors? Okay. Question number 4 was, what are the primary benefits that you hope to achieve in terms of your research and your work? What's the end goals? What are the results that you're really trying to achieve? Okay. So what are the positive results that motivate you to do your work? Do you perhaps want to do some research to help cure a disease? Do you want to do some work so that you can interact closely with people and help them relieve a particular issue that they're working with? So what's the end goals? What aspect of that is that? What really motivates you in terms of research? It is similar to question number 1, but it's slightly different there. Okay. Question number 5 is, how do you prefer to plan your future? Okay. It's not simply just like, what are your future plans? And that's an important part of this question. What are your future personal and professional plans? But also, how are you planning that? Okay. Do you have very structured schedule and goals for yourself? Do you say that, after 5 years, I'm going to get my degree, and after another 5 years, I'm going to be married and have 2.3 kids, have the dog, white picket fence, and all that? Or is it, like, I don't know. I'm just going to figure it out along the way? Are you pretty flexible and adaptable? Okay. So it's not simply just, we want to know what your future career plans are, but also how are you making that those decisions? Okay. So those are the 5 questions. So when Rick and I interviewed students, we had other questions besides these, but these were some of the core questions that we would ask students as we thought about, if they were a good fit. Okay. So these are the 5 themes. Okay. So McGee and Keller, so Rick McGee and Joe Keller, they noted these 5 strong themes among those students who chose the PhD research route. Okay. So this is the punchline, I guess, if you want. So the first one was a curiosity to discover the unknown. Okay? So this was one of the primary motives for doing research. Okay? So when we ask students, what interests you about research, the PhD students often express the idea that I'm at the frontier of understanding and research, and I want to be the first to discover this. Okay? In contrast, there were the students who were suited more for the MD route and said, I want to do research so that I can understand, so I can learn, because I'm very curious. Okay? So those are perfectly fine, viable answers, but they're still very different. Okay? Is that clear about what's the distinction there? Those students who really want to be the first to discover versus someone who simply just want to learn and understand. Okay? So there's a distinction there. Okay? Second theme was just in terms of problem solving, they really enjoyed problems, and they were really good about persisting. Okay? So even though they had obstacles or difficulties or limitations, they just really were persistent, and they struggled through that. Okay? They were willing to be basically very stubborn. Okay? So we're not necessarily saying that MD students weren't good at solving problems, but it's in terms of the spectrum that you might think about, okay? In terms of the level of persistence and enjoyment of challenging problems. Okay? Because think about research, as many of you know, that in terms of research, there's not a textbook you can go to with answers at the end or anything like that, right? There's not like a teacher's edition that you can go to. Okay, that's the answer or anything like that. In terms of research, there is no teacher's edition, right? So you're trying to figure it out. You're trying to understand that yourself. Okay. Number 3 was in terms of interacting with the supervisor or research mentor, they were very independent. Okay. So the interactions with their supervisor, they would kind of meet rarely, and so they often preferred to be independent and try to struggle through problems by themselves. So it's not that they couldn't interact with the research mentor or anything like that, but it's the sense that they really wanted to be by themselves and struggle through a problem because they were really persistent and wanted to solve problems by themselves as much as possible. Okay? The 4th theme was the desire to help others indirectly through research. Okay? So for those people who were interested in research, they wanted to be able to cure a disease that would perhaps help millions of people, but it was indirect, versus like a clinical doctor who would work pretty closely and just work with a few sets of people, but able to help them personally and very directly. Okay, so is that clear in terms of the difference between MD versus PhD folks? Okay. And the fifth theme was, as you think about their future careers, that the PhD folks were often very flexible. And in terms of their approach to their future plans, it was kind of ill-defined. They didn't really have a strong set and say, hey, I'm going to do this by year 5 or whatever. In terms of their future, they were like, oh, I'll just sort of figure my way out as it comes along. This was in contrast to the MD folks who had very clearly set goals and plans. Okay? So there's some flexibility, which is important, in contrast to people who had very set clear goals. Okay? The danger of having very set clear goals in terms of research is that it can become very rigid. And in terms of research, you have to have some flexibility and adaptability because you don't really know how you're going to solve a problem because you might have to do something completely different. You might have to drop it and do something else. So having that flexibility and adaptability was really key in terms of research. Okay. Any questions about these 5? So those are the 5 strong themes that many of the PhD folks encountered. Okay, I guess we'll just move on. Okay. As we think about these 5 themes, I do want to express some precautions here also. You don't have to have all 5 themes to have the perfect fit. Okay, so you might have all 5 as you think about the PhD versus the MD route. Okay, but you don't have to have all of them. And so not all 5 themes were true for all PhD versus MD students and so forth. Okay. And also, I just want to point out that your interests and your preferences can change. Many of you are still trying to develop that and trying to figure out what you want to do next. So you're still growing and developing. So just because right now you find that it's a better fit in one category, you might discover later on that you're actually evolving and changing and shifting slightly directions. So that's perfectly fine too. Okay, so don't feel like you're stuck in one route for the rest of your life or something like that. Okay. I also want to point out that as you probably know, that not all MDs just see patients. There are MDs who also do focus on research. And also, not all PhDs just work on the bench. Okay? There are some PhDs who actually do see patients and so forth. Right? So this is still the anomaly. It's kind of rare, but there are MDs who really do focus on research, and there are PhDs who actually do see patients. Okay? So it's kind of rare, but just keep in mind that you're not simply just stuck in one path for the rest of your life if you just choose the MD versus the PhD route. Okay? Yes? It could be that you would be slightly different. Some people like being sort of slightly different, but so yeah, keep in mind that you might be sort of going against the grain if you're a PhD that does focus on patients or an MD that focuses on research. But there are those exceptions, and so you'll probably find some unity in being sort of rare. So, yeah. Yes. Yeah, so I mean, there are plenty of opportunities. So there's lots of research medical schools where there are permanently for MDs they'll be teaching, and they focus on the research aspects of that. So there are medical schools where they need faculty and they need to conduct research into biomedical research. So yeah, there are probably going to be other primary research centers. I'm guessing there are folks also with MDs in research and industry. And so they need to do biomedical research too. So yeah, so those are other opportunities, yes.
What if the answers to your questions in these 5 characteristics were every other one?
Yeah, yeah. So you might be sort of in between right now. So yeah, and that's probably all many of you who are here. And so yeah, I think part of it maybe sort of depends on where you are in terms of your educational career. I would encourage you to explore both options and try to think about that. So as I said, there is some flexibility so that if you do choose the MD versus the PhD, there is some flexibility. And so there's also the MD/PhD obviously too. So something to think about. So yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I've got some numbers that show in terms of unemployment rates for PhDs, but for PhDs, it's actually pretty low. So the unemployment rate's around 2%. So if you do have a PhD in a STEM discipline, most likely you will have a job. So yeah, I'll show those numbers. So that's a really good segue, but I'll show a little bit of that and elaborate a little bit more. So great questions, though. Other questions? OK, let's move on. Trying to remember. Yeah, so good segue here. So a PhD can provide lots of options. There's this really interesting infographic. I realize it's a little bit busy. If you want to, you can just do a Google search on where will a biology PhD take you, and just do a search on that. And so this was a really interesting infographic. So I won't go through all this in detail, but this graphic shows that each year there starts off with about 16,000 students who start PhD programs in biology all throughout the US. And overall, there's about 86,000 biology PhD students. Most biology PhD students finish their program in about 7 years. And so some of them do drop out. It's about 37%. Most of them do move on to postdoc positions. Some leave the US, but some come from other countries as postdocs. So there's about 68,000 current postdocs, and in a wide range of years that they've been in. So sometimes it can be sort of a vicious cycle here as they get stuck in sort of the postdoc cycle. Often people talk about that. But then as they move on, there's lots of different opportunities in thinking about this. Obviously, there's tenure-track faculty. There's also, though, current bio PhDs doing non-science jobs. There's also current non-research science-related jobs that many of are doing. There's also industry positions, current government researchers, and so forth. So this shows you some of the options. It shows the general trends over the past few years of what's been happening with biology PhDs. Okay, but yeah, I realize this is kind of busy, but just do a search on where will a biology PhD take you. The American Society of Cell Biology put this together, and so it's a really interesting infographic. Okay, talking about unemployment rates and earnings. So as you may know, that in terms of your education, it obviously greatly impacts your employment and your earnings. As you move up, as you get more educational degrees, the unemployment rate gradually declines. Okay, and so for doctoral and professional degrees, it's about 2%. So it's fairly good. Okay, and then also then in terms of median annual earnings, this is in 2013. As you can see, as you get more educational degrees, obviously your salary gradually increases. In terms of professional degrees, obviously it's a little bit higher. It's probably for those, those MBAs and law folks too. Yes.
Sorry, a quick question. Is that 2% of people who have doctoral degrees or 2% of the population?
People who, yeah, so 2% of the people who with doctoral degrees are unemployed. So, or 2.2%, but yeah. So, okay. Okay, so showing a little bit more about the unemployment rate for different disciplines. So these set of numbers actually came out just about a few weeks ago. So the unemployment rates for PhDs in a variety of STEM fields have been consistently low. So in 2008 and 2013, about 5 years difference in all of these different fields. We're talking about 1 to 2%. It's a little bit higher, and for the physical sciences, 2.4 and 2.7, but we're talking very low numbers for unemployment rates. So if you get a STEM PhD, it's pretty low. Okay. So I will admit that in terms of this unemployment rate, it does not reflect underemployment. So people who might be doing temporary jobs or part-time jobs and so forth. Okay. Okay. So just wrapping up with a couple of other slides here. So how will you decide? And we talked about this before with the 5 different methods. Encourage you to do all of them. Okay. So go to conferences, continue to go in conferences like this, look online for information, conduct informational interviews with folks, try these temporary experiences with internships, volunteer, and so forth. And you can check this one off that you consulted this research study. You can obviously look more into that if you wanted to, but hopefully this was a helpful exercise to think about your professional interest and in terms of how you work with other people and so forth too. Okay. So that was about it for me. So I just wanted to stick around if you've got any questions and so forth. Yes. Yes.
In terms of paying for school, what's the difference between the cost of getting an MD versus a PhD or an MD?
So I'm going to express, or just tell you broad generalization. This isn't true for all cases, but usually for like PhD programs, they will provide you with a stipend and tuition waiver. So usually the PhD route as a PhD student will usually cost you less versus an MD program where you will have to basically pay all the tuition. But there are some fellowships for MD programs, but they're generally fewer than PhD programs. But you want to be careful. This is true for PhD routes. For master's program, for almost, I don't want to be careful, but for a lot of master's program, you end up paying for yourself versus a PhD. So that if you become like a master's student versus a PhD student, the PhD students generally get their tuitions waived and so forth and get a stipend and so forth. But the stipend that you get aren't really huge. They're just a small, they probably will cover most of your living expenses. But then MD/PhD programs, they're sort of in between, and so it sort of depends on that. Yeah. So, okay. Question. Yeah. So as I've been interacting with MD/PhDs, I find that most of them are actually using more of one degree versus the other. So they're not always just simply just doing somewhere in between. There are a few who are really focusing on sort of the, sometimes they refer to as translational work, so translational research. And so that's obviously a wonderful area of work to get into. But I find that a lot of them are maybe just focusing on teaching. And so they could have simply just followed the PhD route, or they're just clinician, seeing patients and so forth. So that's what happens, but yeah. Yeah, so as I understand it, what often happens is that they start like their MD route, they will do a couple of years of that, and then they will do their PhD training, and then go back to their MD to finish up. So yeah, so you're sort of bouncing back and forth, and ideally you're doing some sort of overlap between your medical work and your PhD work. But your PhD can be in a wide variety of fields, obviously. Okay. Yes? I guess it sort of depends on which route that you want to focus on, maybe. I guess if you wanted to focus on your PhD, I'm not sure. So yeah, so basically, yeah, I would ask someone else, actually. So that's probably the best thing to do. So I don't want to give an answer that's false. Yes? I've heard that many of them are about 10 years. Yeah. So you got to be in there for the long haul. Well, in typical medical school, that would be 4 years. But then there's things like residency and internships that would follow after that, too. So, yeah. Okay. Yes? Okay. Oh, okay, sorry. I guess you have to walk up, or, yeah. I guess they're trying to record this.
I guess I wanted to know, what was I going to ask? No, I forgot.
Or someone else can use the other mic.
Oh, sorry, no, it was about, I've heard like a lot of MD, PhD programs are really competitive to get into, and I was just kind of wondering, like, how should your grades be? How should your extracurriculars and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, in terms of academic credentials, yeah, for the MD/PhDs, it has to be much higher than for other. So like average GPA, GRE, MCAT scores are going to be higher. So they're much more challenging. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I guess we're trying to use the mics. So.
I mean, in the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned someone who did a PhD in English literature. I'm wondering if that's actually common to see someone doing an MD, PhD where you have something that's not in the STEM field for the PhD?
Yeah, I think that's atypical, but it does obviously happen. So.
Are those programs common?
MD/PhD programs?
Yeah, but not in the STEM field. Like not the would those still be considered MSTP?
Yeah, they're still considered MSTP because they're still doing a medical program, but they're still doing a PhD. But yeah, if it's non-STEM related for the PhD portion, that's rare, but it obviously does happen. So. Okay, maybe try to go to the mic.
You mentioned the 5 characteristics for PhD students. Did they do the same thing for MD students and also PhD MD students?
Yeah, so for the medical school students, they would be just basically the opposite of those 5 themes. And the MD/PhD students were sort of have an overlap of all 5. So they were sort of in between. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for sticking around on a late day. So hopefully the rest of the conference will be really going well for you. So, okay. So I'll stick around if you've got individual questions too. Okay.